Faith Roberts jolted awake to slow, steady breathing and the unmistakable scent of a man she swore she'd never see again. Her pulse raced. She turned, trembling, and her world unraveled. George River, the man who left her at the altar without a word. Now he was lying beside her, on a cruise she wasn't supposed to be on, in a cabin she never meant to enter. His eyes opened, locking on hers. Same smile, same betrayal, and a secret 15 years in the making. The Mediterranean sun filtered through silk curtains, casting golden patterns across unfamiliar mahogany furnishings. Faith's head pounded with more than just the remnants of seasickness medication. This wasn't her modest interior cabin. This was a luxury suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, champagne glasses still sitting on the bedside table, and Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. And George River was right there. His dark hair now threaded with distinguished silver, his face bearing new lines that somehow made him even more devastatingly handsome than the 28-year-old who had shattered her world. He was shirtless, and she couldn't help but notice how his shoulders had broadened, how his chest had filled out, in ways that made her 37-year-old body respond with embarrassing immediacy. Faith? His voice was deeper now, roughened by years she knew nothing about. "What are you doing here?" She scrambled to sit up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She was wearing her pajamas, the sensible cotton ones she'd packed for her solo cruise, not some seductive negligee. At least she hadn't done anything she'd regret. Had she? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't remember how I got here." George sat up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might shatter whatever fragile reality they'd found themselves in. The morning light revealed the changes 15 years had wrought. A scar along his left shoulder she didn't recognize, a small tattoo on his wrist that definitely hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same piercing blue that had haunted her dreams for over a decade. "The storm last night," he said quietly, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that made her chest tighten. "It was pretty rough. You were seasick?" Faith nodded, memories filtering back through the medication haze. The violent rocking of the ship, the overwhelming nausea, the ship's doctor giving her something to help her sleep. But how had she ended up here, in George River's bed, when she'd specifically chosen this cruise because she knew he would never be on it? A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. "Mr. River? It's Steve Wellington for guest services. I need to speak with you about the room situation from last night." Faith's eyes went wide with panic. She dove under the covers as George grabbed a hotel robe from the chair. "Just a moment," George called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. He looked back at Faith, whose terrified face peered out from beneath the luxurious comforter. "Stay quiet," he mouthed. He opened the door just wide enough to speak to the concierge, a well-dressed man in his 40s, carrying a tablet and wearing an apologetic expression. "Mr. River, I sincerely apologize for the confusion last night. During the storm, we had flooding on Deck 7. Several guests had to be relocated while heavily medicated for seasickness. Miss Roberts was moved to your suite's second bedroom, but in the confusion and given her condition, there seems to have been a mix-up with the sleeping arrangements." Faith felt her face burn with mortification. She'd been so drugged that she'd wandered into the wrong bedroom, like some kind of sedated sleepwalker. The second bedroom, there was a second bedroom she was supposed to be in. "Is Miss Roberts' original cabin habitable now?" George asked, his tone professionally neutral, though Faith could hear the slight tension underneath. "Unfortunately, no, sir. The damage was quite extensive. We can move her to another cabin today, though it may take a few hours to prepare." "That's fine. She'll manage until then. Again, our sincerest apologies. The company will, of course, comp Miss Roberts' entire cruise fare and provide additional compensation for the inconvenience." Faith heard the door close and George's footsteps approaching the bed. She emerged from her hiding spot, her dark hair tousled, her brown eyes wide with embarrassment and something else, something that looked dangerously like the longing that had once consumed them both. "Well," George said, settling on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain distance, That explains the mystery. Faith wrapped her arms around her knees, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, sharing morning light and whispered conversations like they had 15 years ago when the world was full of promise and wedding plans. "This is impossible," she murmured. "Of all the cruise ships in all the Mediterranean." "Silent. You're quoting Casablanca now?" George's mouth quivered in what might have been a smile. "Some things never change." "Everything changed," Faith said sharply, the pain of 15 years crystallizing into anger. "You made sure of that." The smile disappeared from George's face, replaced by something that looked like genuine anguish. "Faith, if you knew—" "I don't want to know," she interrupted, scrambling out of the bed and searching for her belongings. "I just want to get out of here and pretend this never happened." But as she moved around the cabin, gathering her scattered items, her book from the nightstand, her glasses from the dresser, her cruise key card from the floor, she was acutely aware of George watching her every movement. She caught him staring at how her pajama pants hugged curves that had developed since she was 22. The way her hair fell across her shoulder when she bent to retrieve her phone. "You look—" he started, then stopped himself. "Different?" Faith supplied coolly. "Older? More mature? Yes, that's what 15 years will do to a person." "Beautiful," George finished quietly. "You look beautiful, Faith. More beautiful than I remembered, and I remembered everything." The words hit her like a physical blow. She straightened slowly, clutching her cruise key card so tightly it cut into her palm. "Don't," she whispered. "You don't get to say things like that. Not after what you did." "What did I do?" George stood, and suddenly the cabin felt much smaller. "Faith, you don't understand what happened that day." "I understand perfectly." Her voice was rising now, all the pain and humiliation of 15 years pouring out. "I understand that I was standing in a wedding dress in front of 200 people, waiting for a groom who decided I wasn't worth showing up for. I understand that you disappeared without a word, without an explanation, without even the courtesy of a breakup conversation." They were standing close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, close enough to smell that familiar cologne that still made her knees weak despite everything. "I had reasons," George said, his voice low and intense. "Good reasons that I couldn't explain then, and that you probably won't believe now. Try me." A challenge hung between them, and for a moment, Faith thought he might actually do it, might finally give her the explanation she'd craved for 15 years. But then his phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the spell. George glanced at it, and his expression tightened. "I have to take this. It's business." Of course it was. Just like 15 years ago, business always came first. "Get dressed," Faith said coolly, moving toward what she hoped was the second bedroom. "I'll stay out of your way until they can move me to another cabin." But as she reached for the door handle, it rattled from the outside. Someone was coming in. Have you ever woken up next to someone from your past you thought you'd never see again? That moment when 15 years disappear in an instant? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if this story is already pulling at your heartstrings. George reacted instantly, pulling Faith against him and pressing her back against the door. His body was warm and solid against hers, his arms creating a protective cage around her, as footsteps approached in the hallway outside. They were so close, she could feel his heartbeat against her chest, could see the way his eye that darkened as he looked down at her. For a suspended moment, 15 years collapsed into nothing. They were 22 and 28 again, young and desperately in love, with all the time in the world stretching ahead of them. George's head dipped slightly, his lips moving closer to hers, and Faith felt herself leaning into him, despite every rational thought screaming at her to pull away. The almost kiss hung between them, electrifying and terrifying, until the footsteps passed by the door without stopping. They sprang apart as if burned, both breathing hard, both staring at each other with expressions of shock and something that looked dangerously like hunger. "I should," Faith stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the second bedroom. "Yes," George agreed, his voice rough. "You should." But neither of them moved for several heartbeats, caught in the gravitational pull of everything they'd once been to each other. Finally, Faith forced herself to step away, to reach for the door handle with trembling fingers. As she slipped into the adjoining bedroom, she heard George's ragged exhale behind her, and she knew with devastating certainty that nothing about this cruise was going to go according to plan. The second bedroom was smaller but still luxurious, with its own bathroom and a view of the endless blue Mediterranean. Faith sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly unsteady, and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. George River. After 15 years of carefully constructed walls, of therapy sessions and self-help books and determined moves forward, one accidental night in his presence had reduced her to the trembling 22-year-old who had loved him with every fiber of her being. She could hear him talking on the phone in the next room, his voice too low to make out words, but carrying that same authoritative tone that had once made her feel so protected and cherished. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. Faith forced herself to stand, to move to the bathroom and splash cold water on her face. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd just woken up next to her greatest mistake and discovered that 15 years hadn't dimmed the attraction one bit. She had to get through this. She had to find a way to survive whatever cosmic joke had put George River on her cruise, in her accidentally assigned bedroom, looking at her with eyes that still held traces of the love that had once been her entire world. But as she heard his phone call end and his footsteps approaching her door, Faith realized that getting through this might be the greatest challenge of her life. Because seeing George again hadn't just reopened old wounds, it had awakened feelings she'd spent 15 years trying to bury, and the way he'd looked at her in that moment before their almost kiss suggested that she wasn't the only one fighting a losing battle against the past. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Faith. George's voice was carefully controlled through the door. I'm going to shower and then head to the business center to make some calls. You can do whatever you need to do. Thank you, she managed, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. She heard his footsteps retreat, then the sound of running water from the main bathroom. Faith closed her eyes and tried to center herself, but all she could think about was George in the shower just yards away, water cascading over that broader chest, those shoulders that had once been her safe harbor. Stop it, she commanded herself. Just stop. Faith quickly gathered her toiletries and dressed in the casual sundress she'd planned to wear for her first day of solo exploration. The soft yellow fabric brought out the warm undertones in her dark skin, and she'd learned to dress in ways that celebrated the curves she'd gained over the years rather than hiding them. At 37, she was more confident in her body than she'd ever been at 22, even if seeing George made her feel like that insecure young woman all over again. When she emerged from the second bedroom, George was dressed in khakis and a white linen shirt that made his eyes look impossibly blue. His hair was still damp from the shower, and Faith had to grip the doorframe to steady herself against the wave of memory that crashed over her. The business center is on deck 5, George said without quite meeting her eyes. I'll be there for most of the morning. The suite is yours until they can relocate you. Faith nodded, not trusting her voice. This polite distance was almost worse than the tension of waking up together. At least the tension had felt real. This felt like they were strangers making small talk. Faith, George said as he reached the cabin door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About this morning, about the confusion, about... He paused, his hand on the door handle. About everything. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in his luxury suite with the lingering scent of his cologne and 1,000 unanswered questions. Faith spent the next hour exploring the ship, trying to orient herself and regain some sense of control. The Mediterranean sun was brilliant on the deck, and the ship's amenities were more luxurious than anything she'd ever experienced. This was supposed to be her healing cruise, her celebration of finally moving forward with her life after ending a 3-year relationship with Marcus, a perfectly nice man she'd never quite loved the way she should have. Instead, she'd stumbled directly into the past she'd been running from. Faith, there you are. She turned to see Celine Drew hurrying toward her, her best friend's face creased with worry. Celine was a study in contrasts, Petite where Faith was tall, blonde where Faith was brunette, impulsive where Faith was cautious. They'd been friends since college, and Celine had been the one to suggest this cruise as a way to celebrate Faith's newfound freedom. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Celine continued, slightly out of breath. "You missed breakfast, and when I went to your cabin, they said there had been some kind of flooding situation. Are you okay? You look terrible," Faith supplied. "Shaken," Celine corrected, studying her friend's face with the intensity of someone who'd known her for 15 years. "What happened? And don't tell me it was just the storm, because I've seen you in storms before." Faith looked around the busy deck, families laughing and couples holding hands, everyone blissfully unaware that her world had tilted off its axis. "Can we find somewhere private to talk?" Celine's eyes sharpened with concern, but she nodded. "The library. It's usually empty at this time of day." The ship's library was indeed deserted, a quiet sanctuary of leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Faith sank into one of the chairs and tried to figure out how to explain the impossible. "George River is on this ship," she said finally. Celine went very still. "I'm sorry, what?" "George, my George, the George who left me at the altar 15 years ago. He's here, on this cruise, and due to some mix-up with the storm damage, I spent the night in his cabin." "You what?" Celine's voice rose to a near shriek before she caught herself and glanced around the empty library. "Faith, please tell me you're kidding." "I woke up next to him this morning." Celine stared at her for a long moment, then sat down heavily in the adjacent chair. Okay, let's think about this rationally. Did anything happen?" "No," Faith said quickly, then paused. "I mean, I was heavily medicated for seasickness. I don't remember how I got there, but I was in my pajamas, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. But nothing happened. Nothing could have happened." "But you wanted it to," Celine said quietly, reading her friend's face with devastating accuracy. Faith's silence was answer enough. "Oh, honey." Celine reached over and squeezed Faith's hand. "What are you going to do?" "Avoid him for the rest of the cruise," Faith said firmly. "They're moving me to a different cabin today. I'll do my own thing, he'll do his, and we'll pretend this never happened." "On a ship?" Celine raised an eyebrow. "Faith, this isn't exactly a large metropolitan city. It's a floating hotel in the middle of the Mediterranean. You're going to run into him." As if summoned by her words, George appeared in the library doorway. He was carrying a tablet and wore a frown that suggested his morning calls hadn't gone well. When he saw Faith, he stopped short. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes flicking between Faith and Celine. "I didn't realize anyone was in here. I'll find somewhere else to work." "No need," Faith said, standing quickly. "We were just leaving." But as she moved toward the door, the ship hit a particularly large wave, and Faith stumbled. George's reflexes were instant. He dropped his tablet and caught her against his chest, his strong arms wrapping around her waist to steady her. For a moment they were frozen in that embrace, Faith's hands pressed against his chest, George's face inches from hers. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palms, could see the way his pupils dilated as he looked down at her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his hands still spanning her waist. Faith nodded, unable to speak. This close, she could see the tiny scar by his left eye that she'd kissed 1,000 times, could smell the familiar scent of his skin beneath the expensive cologne. Her body remembered him in ways her mind had tried to forget, and she found herself leaning into his strength despite every rational thought telling her to pull away. "Faith," George murmured, and something in his voice made her look up to meet his eyes. The moments stretched between them, electric and dangerous, until Celine cleared her throat pointedly. "Perhaps we should all sit down," she suggested dryly, "before someone else falls over." George released Faith immediately, stepping back with what looked like effort. Faith smoothed her dress with shaking hands, acutely aware that her body was still humming from his touch. "George, this is my friend Celine Drew," Faith said, grasping for normalcy. "Celine, this is George River." "Ah," Celine said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The George. I've heard so much about you." George shook her hand, his expression carefully neutral. All bad, I'm sure. Not all, Celine replied sweetly. Faith has very fond memories of your relationship. Right up until the part where you disappeared without a trace. Celine, Faith warned. What? I'm just making conversation. George's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. I'm sure Faith has told you her version of events. Her version? Celine's eyebrows rose. Is there another version where abandoning your fiancé at the altar is somehow acceptable? You don't know what you're talking about, George said, and for the first time, Faith heard heat in his voice. Then enlighten me, Celine challenged, because from where I sat, in the front row of that church, watching my best friend's heartbreak in real time, it looked pretty straightforward. Stop, Faith said firmly, stepping between them. Both of you, just stop. But the damage was done. The careful politeness George had maintained all morning had cracked, revealing the raw emotion underneath. He was breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You want to know what happened, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You want to know why I left. George, don't, Faith whispered, recognizing the signs of his temper from years past. I left because I loved her, George continued, his eyes locked on Celine's. Because I loved her so much that I was willing to sacrifice everything. My happiness, my future, her opinion of me, to keep her safe. Safe from what? Celine demanded. George's mouth opened, then closed. The fire went out of his eyes, replaced by something that looked like defeat. It doesn't matter now, he said quietly. It's ancient history. He turned to leave, but Faith caught his arm. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them, and George stared down at her hand on his sleeve with an expression of such longing that it took Faith's breath away. It matters to me, she said softly. For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her, might finally give her the explanation she'd needed for 15 years. But then his phone buzzed, breaking the spell. George glanced at it and his expression shuddered. I have to take this call, he said, gently extracting his arm from her grip. Excuse me. He left the library, and Faith sank back into her chair, emotionally drained. Well, Celine said after a moment, that was illuminating. Was it? Faith asked tiredly. Because I'm more confused than ever. Faith, did you see the way he looked at you, the way he reacted when I brought up the wedding? Celine leaned forward. That man is still in love with you, desperately, completely in love with you. Don't, Faith said, closing her eyes. Just don't. Whatever he felt 15 years ago, whatever he feels now, it doesn't matter. He made his choice. Did he? Celine asked gently. Because from what I just witnessed, it sounds like there might be more to the story than we knew. Faith opened her eyes to find her friend watching her with sympathetic concern. Even if there is, Faith said, finally, it doesn't change anything. He still left. He still chose to hurt me rather than trust me with whatever truth he was carrying. That's not love, Celine. That's fear. Maybe, Celine agreed, but fear can make people do terrible things, even good people, even people who love us. Faith stood, suddenly needing air and space and distance from this conversation. I'm going to walk around the deck, she said. Clear my head. Want company? Actually, I think I need some time alone. Celine nodded understandingly. I'll be in the spa if you need me. And Faith, whatever happened 15 years ago, whatever's happening now, you don't have to figure it all out today. Just take it one moment at a time. Faith made her way to the ship's upper deck, where the Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility. She found a quiet spot at the railing and looked out at the endless blue horizon, trying to make sense of the morning's revelations. George had said he left because he loved her, because he wanted to keep her safe. Safe from what? What could have been so terrible that abandoning her at the altar seemed like the better option? And why, after 15 years of believing she'd moved on, did seeing him again make her feel like that 22-year-old girl who'd thought love could conquer anything? The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and her heart skipped when she saw George walking toward her. He changed into swim shorts and a t-shirt, and Faith tried not to notice how well they showed off his still impressive physique. I finished my calls, he said, stopping a careful distance away. Thought I might take a swim. Faith nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. the weight of 15 years and one confusing morning stretching between them. "Faith," George said finally. "About what I said in the library. You don't have to explain." Faith interrupted. "It's none of my business anymore. Isn't it?" George moved closer, and Faith's pulse quickened. "You were the most important person in my life for 4 years. You were going to be my wife. If anyone deserves an explanation, it's you." Faith turned to face him fully, searching his expression for any sign of the man she'd once known so well. "Then why haven't you given me one?" she asked quietly. "You've had 15 years, George. 15 years to pick up a phone, to write a letter, to find me and tell me whatever truth was so important that it was worth destroying our entire future." George ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Faith's chest ache. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I was 28 years old, and terrified, and I thought I was making the right choice. Because by the time I realized I was wrong, too much time had passed, and I figured you'd moved on." "I did move on," Faith said, though the words felt hollow. "I had to." "I know." George's voice was soft, filled with a pain that matched her own. "I saw the engagement announcement in the paper 3 years ago. Marcus Henley. He seemed like a good man." Faith blinked, surprised. "You kept track of me?" "I never stopped keeping track of you," George admitted. "I know that makes me sound like a stalker, but I needed to know that you were okay, that you were happy." "I was," Faith said automatically, then stopped. Was she happy with Marcus? Or had she simply been settled? Comfortable in a relationship that would never break her heart because she'd never loved him enough to give him that power? "Were you?" George asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Because when I saw that the engagement was called off last year, I wondered." "How did you—" "Never mind." Faith shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Marcus and I weren't right for each other. We both knew it." "Because you didn't love him?" The question hung between them, dangerous and loaded with implication. Faith looked away, unable to meet George's intense gaze. "Love isn't always enough," she said finally. "Sometimes it's not even the most important thing." "Isn't it?" George moved closer, close enough that Faith could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Because I've spent 15 years learning that nothing else matters. Not success, not money, not safety. Nothing matters if you don't have love." Faith's breath caught. "George, I know I have no right to say this," he continued, his voice low and urgent. "I know I forfeited any claim to your heart the day I walked away. But seeing you again, being near you, it's like the last 15 years never happened. Like we're still those people who were so crazy about each other that we couldn't stand to be apart for more than a few hours." Faith closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and the matching intensity of her own response. Her body was singing with awareness, every nerve ending attuned to his proximity. "We're not those people anymore," she whispered. "Too much has happened, too much time has passed." "Has it?" George reached out, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "Because right now, looking at you, I feel exactly like that 28-year-old who fell in love with a brilliant, beautiful girl who challenged him and inspired him and made him want to be better than he ever thought he could be." Faith opened her eyes, and the look in George's face nearly undid her. The love was still there, raw and desperate and real. And terrifyingly, she could feel her own walls beginning to crumble in response. "I can't do this," she said, stepping back from his touch. "I won't let you hurt me again." "I don't want to hurt you," George said urgently. "Faith, if you knew, then tell me." The words burst out of her, all her frustration and confusion and lingering pain condensing into that desperate plea. "Whatever secret you've been carrying for 15 years, whatever was so important that you chose it over me. Tell me now." George stared at her for a long moment, conflict written across his features. Faith held her breath, hoping that finally, she might get the answers she'd needed for so long. But then his phone rang, shattering the moment. George glanced at it and his expression tightened. "I have to take this," he said, and Faith heard the regret in his voice. "It's about my business partner. There's been a situation." Of course there had. Just like 15 years ago, something was always more important than their conversation, more urgent than her need to understand. "Go," Faith said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Handle your situation. George hesitated, clearly torn. Faith, we're not done talking about this, aren't we? Faith turned back to the railing, presenting him with her back. Because it feels pretty familiar to me. She heard him sigh, heard his footsteps retreat as he answered his phone. Only when she was sure he was gone did Faith allow herself to slump against the railing, emotionally exhausted. 15 years and nothing had really changed. George was still the man who would choose duty over love, responsibility over honesty. And she was still the woman foolish enough to hope that this time might be different. But as the ship cut through the sparkling Mediterranean waters, toward their next port of call, Faith couldn't shake the memory of the look in George's eyes when he touched her face. Whatever secrets he was keeping, whatever had driven him away 15 years ago, one thing was devastatingly clear. He was still in love with her. The question was whether that love was worth the risk of letting him break her heart all over again. Faith spent the rest of the morning exploring the ship with determined focus, visiting the art gallery, the shops, and the various lounges. She was a marketing executive for a non-profit organization back in Chicago, and she'd learned to compartmentalize her emotions when necessary. She would not let George River derail her first real vacation in 3 years. But everywhere she went, she found herself scanning the crowds for a familiar figure. And when she didn't see him, she felt both relieved and disappointingly hollow. By lunchtime, the ship was experiencing rougher seas as they headed toward their afternoon port in Santorini. Faith made her way to the main dining room, hoping to find Celine and pretend that everything was normal. The dining room was elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the choppy Mediterranean. Faith had just spotted Celine at a table near the windows when the ship hit a particularly large wave. She stumbled, her hand reaching out for balance, when strong arms caught her from behind. She knew without looking that it was George. Her body recognized his touch immediately, responding with a flutter of awareness that had nothing to do with the ship's motion. "Steady," he murmured close to her ear, his hands spanning her waist to stabilize her against his chest. Faith felt herself melting into his strength, the way she always had. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be cherished, to be protected, to be the center of someone's world. "Thank you," she managed, stepping away from his embrace before she could do something foolish like turn in his arms and kiss him. George's hands lingered on her waist for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "The seas are getting rougher. You should be careful." Faith nodded, not trusting her voice. George was dressed in a navy blazer that brought out his eyes, and she couldn't help but notice how other women in the dining room were stealing glances at him. He'd always been devastating, but the confidence that came with success and maturity had only enhanced his appeal. "Faith, there you are." Celine appeared at her elbow, shooting a speculative look between Faith and George. "I saved you a seat." "Actually," George said, surprising them both, "I was hoping Faith might join me for lunch. I have some things I'd like to discuss with her." Faith's pulse quickened. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," George said quietly, and something in his voice made her look at him. "Just lunch, in a public place, with 100 other people around. What could happen?" Everything, Faith thought, everything could happen. But Celine was already nudging her forward. "Go," her friend whispered. "You need to hear what he has to say." Before Faith could protest, she found herself being led to a table in a quiet corner of the dining room. George pulled out her chair, a gentlemanly gesture that sent her back in time to when such courtesies had been routine between them. "You look beautiful today," George said, once they were seated. "That dress brings out the gold in your eyes." Faith glanced down at her emerald sundress, pleased despite herself that he'd noticed. "Thank you." The waiter appeared, and George ordered wine, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to fine dining. Faith remembered when they'd been young and broke, splitting appetizers and drinking house wine, dreaming of the day they could afford luxuries like this. "You've done well for yourself," she observed, gesturing at his expensive watch, his tailored clothes. "The business seems to be thriving." George's expression darkened slightly. "River Maritime has been successful, yes. Though success comes with its own complications, such as," George studied her face for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Such as learning that people you trust aren't always trustworthy, and that decisions you made years ago can come back to haunt you in ways you never expected. Faith felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What kind of decisions? But before George could answer, a striking woman with platinum blonde hair and razor-sharp cheekbones appeared at their table. She was tall, elegant, and expensively dressed in the way that suggested old money rather than new wealth. "George, darling," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Faith couldn't place. "I've been looking everywhere for you." George's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Anastasia, I didn't expect to see you at lunch." "Well, you were answering your phone," Anastasia replied, her pale blue eyes flicking dismissively over Faith. "We need to discuss the Montenegro deal." "Is this Faith Roberts?" George said, his voice carefully neutral. "Faith, this is Anastasia Gray, my business partner." Business partner. The words hit Faith like cold water. Of course George had a business partner. A beautiful, sophisticated business partner who looked at him with proprietary familiarity and called him darling. "How lovely," Anastasia said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Are you enjoying your cruise, Miss Roberts?" "Very much," Faith replied, keeping her voice steady. "And you?" "Oh, this isn't pleasure for me," Anastasia laughed, the sound like crystalline bells. "George and I are here for business. We're considering acquiring a shipping company based in Crete, and we thought it would be efficient to combine the negotiations with a little Mediterranean tour." Faith felt something twist in her chest. George hadn't mentioned that this was a business trip, hadn't mentioned that he was traveling with someone. Someone who was clearly much more than just a business partner, judging by the way she rested her hand possessively on his shoulder. "I see," Faith said carefully. "How long have you been partners?" 3 years, Anastasia replied before George could speak. "We met when George was expanding into European markets. I suppose you could say it was fate. We complement each other perfectly, both professionally and personally." The implication was clear, and Faith felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I should let you get back to your business," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Thank you for lunch, George." "Faith, wait." George started to rise, but Anastasia's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let her go, darling," Anastasia said softly, but loud enough for Faith to hear. "We have work to do." Faith walked away with as much dignity as she could muster, acutely aware of the curious glances from other diners. She'd made it halfway across the dining room, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Faith, stop." She turned to find George approaching, his expression frustrated, and something that looked like panic in his eyes. "What?" Anastasia said. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" Faith kept her voice low, conscious of their audience. "Because it sounded pretty clear to me. You're here on business, with your business partner, who's obviously much more than that, and I'm the inconvenient complication from your past who happened to end up in your bed." "That's not true." George moved closer, and Faith caught a whiff of his cologne, the scent that had once meant safety and love and home. "Anastasia and I, we're not. It's complicated." "Everything's complicated with you, George," Faith said, the words coming out more bitter than she'd intended. "It was complicated 15 years ago, and apparently it's still complicated now. Faith, please, let me explain." "No." Faith held up a hand to stop him. "I don't need an explanation. I don't need anything from you except to be left alone." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding with humiliation and an anger that surprised her with its intensity. What had she expected? That George would be pining away for 15 years, waiting for her to stumble back into his life? That a successful, attractive man like him would be alone? Faith made it to the elevator before the tears started threatening, and she punched the button for her deck with more force than necessary. She needed to get to her new cabin, needed space to process the emotional whiplash of the morning. But when the elevator doors opened, George was standing inside. "Going up?" he asked quietly. Faith hesitated, then stepped inside. The elevator was small, and George's presence seemed to fill the entire space. She pressed the button for Deck 7 and tried to ignore the way her body responded to his proximity. "Faith," George said as the elevator began to rise, "what you saw back there with Anastasia, Is none of my business, Faith interrupted. You made that clear 15 years ago. I never stopped loving you. The words hit Faith like a physical blow, and she turned to stare at him in shock. George was looking at her with such raw intensity that it took her breath away. Don't, she whispered. Don't say things like that. Why not? It's the truth. George moved closer, and Faith found herself backed against the elevator wall. I've tried to move on, tried to build a life without you. But every woman I've ever been with has been a poor substitute for what we had. George, even Anastasia, he continued, his voice low and urgent. Yes, we've been involved, but she's never been you, Faith. No one has ever been you. Faith's heart was racing, her body responding to his nearness despite her mind's protests. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. That doesn't change anything, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Doesn't it? George braced his hands on either side of her head, caging her against the wall. Because right now, looking at you, being this close to you, it feels like everything has changed. The elevator shuddered slightly as it continued its ascent, and Faith used the motion as an excuse to steady herself with her hands on George's chest. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them, and George's pupils dilated as he looked down at her. Faith, he murmured, and she could see him struggling for control. The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Faith found herself remembering the weight of his body against hers, the way he used to kiss her until she forgot her own name, the way he could make her feel like the most beautiful, most cherished woman in the world. We can't, she breathed, even as her body betrayed her by swaying toward him. Can't we? George's head dipped lower, his lips inches from hers. God, Faith, I've missed you. I've missed this. Faith felt herself drowning in the blue of his eyes, in the familiar scent of his skin, in the magnetic pull that had always existed between them. Her hands fisted in his shirt, torn between pushing him away and pulling him closer. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors began to open. George immediately stepped back, and Faith quickly straightened her dress, both of them breathing hard. An elderly couple entered the elevator, chatting pleasantly about their plans for the afternoon in Santorini, oblivious to the tension crackling in the small space. Faith and George stood on opposite sides of the elevator, carefully not looking at each other, but Faith could feel the awareness humming between them like a live wire. When the elevator reached her floor, she practically fled into the corridor. Faith, George called softly, and she turned back despite herself. This isn't over, he said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. The elevator doors closed before she could respond, leaving Faith alone in the corridor with her racing heart and the devastating realization that despite 15 years of trying to forget him, George River could still affect her like no other man ever had. She made it to her new cabin, a modest interior room that was perfectly adequate but felt cramped after the luxury of George's suite. Faith sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. This was a disaster. She'd come on this cruise to celebrate her independence, to prove to herself that she was happy and whole and ready to move forward with her life. Instead, she'd fallen right back into the orbit of the man who'd nearly destroyed her once before. And the worst part was that despite everything, despite Anastasia Gray and 15 years of silence and the knowledge that George was still keeping secrets, part of her wanted to forget all the rational reasons why being near him was dangerous. Because in that elevator, pressed against the wall with George's body caging her in, she'd felt more alive than she had in years. Faith's phone buzzed with a text from Celine. How was lunch? Please tell me you didn't murder him. Faith stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could she explain that lunch had lasted 10 minutes before being interrupted by George's beautiful business partner? How could she describe the elevator encounter that had left her shaken and confused and desperately wanting things she couldn't have? Another text appeared. We're docking in Santorini in an hour. Want to explore together? Faith typed back, yes, I need distraction. That bad? Worse. There was a pause. Then, bring sunscreen and comfortable shoes. We're going to walk until you forget all about George River. Faith almost laughed at that. She'd been trying to forget George River for 15 years, and 5 minutes in an elevator had undone all that progress. But maybe Celine was right. Maybe what she needed was distraction, beautiful scenery, and the reminder that there was a whole world beyond the complicated man who'd once been her everything. She changed into walking clothes and headed for the deck, determined to enjoy her afternoon in one of the most beautiful places on earth. George River might be on this ship, might be able to make her pulse race with a single look, but she was stronger now than she'd been at 22. She would not let him derail her life again. But as Faith walked toward the gangway where passengers were already beginning to disembark for their Santorini excursion, she couldn't shake the memory of George's words, "This isn't over." Deep in her heart, she knew he was right. Whatever had started between them 15 years ago, whatever had brought them both to this ship at this moment in time, it was far from over. The question was whether she was brave enough to see it through to whatever ending awaited them. Santorini was everything Faith had dreamed it would be. Whitewashed buildings cascading down cliffsides, brilliant blue domes against an azure sky, narrow cobblestone streets filled with the scent of bougainvillea and the sound of laughter. She and Celine spent the afternoon exploring the village of Aya, taking photos and buying trinkets, and for brief moments, Faith almost forgot about the emotional chaos waiting back on the ship. Almost. But as they sat in a clifftop cafe, watching the famous Santorini sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Faith found her eyes scanning the other tourists for a familiar figure. "He's not here," Celine said gently, following her gaze. "Who's not here?" Faith asked, attempting innocence. "George. You've been looking for him all afternoon." Faith sighed and took a sip of her wine. "I have not. Honey, you nearly walked into 3 different walls because you were craning your neck to check out every tall, dark-haired man we passed. I was being observant." "You were being lovesick," Celine corrected, with affectionate exasperation. "Faith, what happened at lunch? You said it was worse than bad, but you haven't given me details." Faith watched the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the Mediterranean in shades of liquid gold. "He has a business partner, a beautiful, sophisticated woman named Anastasia Gray, who clearly thinks of him as much more than just a colleague." "Ah," Celine nodded understandingly. "And how did George react to this woman?" "He said it was complicated." "Everything's complicated when you're trying not to hurt feelings," Celine observed. "Did he seem involved with her?" Faith considered the question. She acted like they were together, but George seemed uncomfortable with her assumptions. He said. Faith paused, unsure whether to voice George's declaration of love. "He said what?" "He said he never stopped loving me." Celine nearly choked on her wine. "He what?" "In the elevator afterward, he said I was irreplaceable, that every woman he'd been with had been a substitute for what we had." "And what did you say?" "Nothing coherent," Faith admitted. "I was trapped against the elevator wall, and he was so close I could barely think. And then other people got on, and the moment was broken." Celine leaned back in her chair, studying her friend's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Faith, can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway. Why did you really break up with Marcus?" The question caught Faith off guard. "We weren't compatible. We wanted different things." That's what she told everyone, including me. But was that really it? Faith shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" "I mean Marcus Henley was everything you said you wanted after George. He was stable, predictable, emotionally available. He wanted marriage and kids and a house in the suburbs. He was safe. Safe isn't necessarily bad. No, but it isn't love either." Celine leaned forward. "You broke up with Marcus 6 months after George's mother died." Faith went very still. "How do you know about George's mother?" "Because you knew. Because despite claiming you wanted nothing to do with him, you still followed his life enough to know when he lost his mother. And 3 weeks after the funeral, you ended a 3-year relationship with a perfectly good man." Faith felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had known about Eleanor Rivers' death, and seen the obituary online, and spent an entire day fighting the urge to send condolences. She'd remembered how close George had been to his mother, how devastated he would be by her loss. "That's a coincidence," she said weakly. "Is it? Or did learning that George was grieving make you realize that you were still emotionally unavailable to any other man?" Faith stared out at the darkening sea, unable to deny the truth in Celine's words. She had broken up with Marcus shortly after learning of Eleanor Rivers' death, though she'd convinced herself it was because Marcus had started pressuring her about marriage. Even if that's true, Faith said finally, it doesn't change anything. George made his choice 15 years ago. Whatever he's feeling now, whatever I'm feeling, it's just nostalgia mixed with physical attraction. Is it? Celine asked gently. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like unfinished business. Before Faith could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Faith, it's George. I got your number from guest services. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to see you tonight. There are things I should have told you 15 years ago. Things you deserve to know. I'll be on the observatory deck at 10 p.m. if you're willing to listen. No pressure, no expectations, just truth, finally. Faith stared at the message, her heart racing. What is it? Celine asked, noticing Faith's expression. Faith silently handed over her phone. Celine read the message and whistled softly. Well, that's dramatic. I'm not going, Faith said immediately. Of course you're not, Celine agreed. Because why would you want answers to the questions that have haunted you for 15 years? Because those answers won't change what he did. They won't give me back the years I spent rebuilding myself after he destroyed my ability to trust. No, Celine said quietly, but they might give you peace. They finished their wine in contemplative silence as the last light faded from the sky. Around them, other tourists laughed and took photos and planned their evening adventures. But Faith felt suspended between past and present, between the safety of ignorance and the dangerous allure of truth. Back on the ship, Faith stood in her small cabin, staring at her reflection in the mirror. It was 9:45 p.m. George would be waiting on the observatory deck in 15 minutes, and she still hadn't decided whether to meet him. Part of her, the rational, self-protective part, knew she should stay away. Whatever George had to say, it would only complicate things further. She was finally in a good place in her life. Finally happy with her independence and her career and her carefully constructed emotional equilibrium. But another part of her, the part that had never quite healed from his abandonment, desperately needed to know why he'd left. What could have been so important, so urgent, that disappearing without explanation had seemed like the only option. At 9:58, Faith found herself walking toward the elevator. The observatory deck was deserted except for George, who stood at the far railing looking out at the star-filled Mediterranean sky. He'd changed into dark jeans and a white shirt, and in the moonlight, he looked achingly familiar, like the young man who'd once been her entire world. You came, he said softly, when he heard her footsteps. I almost didn't. George turned to face her, and Faith could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his expression. I wasn't sure you would. After this afternoon, after Anastasia. Is she your girlfriend? Faith asked, needing to know before they went any further. George was quiet for a long moment. It's complicated. Stop saying that, Faith said with more heat than she'd intended. Everything isn't complicated, George. Either you're with her or you're not. We've been involved for about 2 years, George said carefully. But it's not what you think. It's not what she thinks either. Apparently, Faith felt a stab of jealousy that she had no right to feel. What does that mean? George ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Anastasia and I became partners when I was expanding River Maritime into European markets. She's brilliant, ambitious, and she comes from a shipping family with connections I needed. The business relationship evolved into something personal. But, Faith prompted when he trailed off. But I was never in love with her, George said quietly. I cared about her, yes. I respected her intelligence and her drive. But I was never able to give her my whole heart because, he looked directly at Faith, because you still had it. Faith felt her breath catch. George. I know how that sounds, he continued. I know I have no right to say it after what I did to you. But it's the truth, Faith. For 15 years, I've been comparing every woman to you, and they've all come up short. Then why? Faith's voice broke slightly. Why did you leave me? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me whatever was wrong? George was quiet for so long that Faith wondered if he'd changed his mind about telling her. When he finally spoke, His voice was heavy with old pain. "Do you remember Victor Blackstone?" Faith frowned, searching her memory. "The name sounds familiar." "He was a business rival of my father's. Blackstone Shipping had been trying to acquire River Maritime for years, but my father always refused to sell. Victor was ruthless. He believed that any tactic was justified if it achieved his goals." "What does this have to do with us?" George moved closer, and Faith could see the anguish in his expression. 3 days before our wedding, Victor approached my sister Constance. She was 19, working as an assistant in our company's legal department. Victor told her that he had evidence, fabricated evidence, that you were feeding information about River Maritime's business practices to our competitors. Faith felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "He had documents, emails, financial records, all fake, but sophisticated enough to fool investigators, at least initially. He said if I went through with the wedding, he would turn the evidence over to the authorities and the media. You would have been arrested for corporate espionage. Your career would have been destroyed, and you might have gone to prison." Faith stared at him in shock. "But it was all fake." "Yes, but that wouldn't have mattered in the short term. By the time we proved the documents were fabricated, the damage would have been done. Your reputation would have been ruined, and River Maritime would have been destroyed by the scandal. So you just believed him? You didn't think to tell me to fight back, too?" "I was 28 years old and terrified," George said desperately. Victor had a reputation for following through on his threats. My father had always said that Victor Blackstone would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And what he wanted was to destroy my family's company. Faith felt sick. "So you destroyed me instead." "I thought I was protecting you," George said, his voice raw with emotion. "I thought if I disappeared, if I made it look like I was the one with cold feet, Victor would leave you alone. I thought you'd be hurt for a while, but you'd recover. You'd find someone better, someone who could give you the life you deserved without putting you in danger. You thought wrong." The words came out sharp and bitter. "Do you have any idea what it was like, George? Standing in that church in my wedding dress, waiting for you to show up? Having to face 200 people and tell them the wedding was off because the groom had simply vanished?" Tears were streaming down Faith's face now. All the pain and humiliation of that day crashing over her anew. "I thought I wasn't enough," she continued, her voice breaking. "I thought you'd realized you didn't love me, that you'd found someone else, that I'd somehow failed to be the woman you wanted to marry." "Faith, no." George reached for her, but she stepped back. "I blamed myself for years. I questioned every memory, every moment we'd shared. I wondered if I'd imagined the love, if I'd been so desperate to be loved that I'd constructed an entire relationship out of wishful thinking." "You didn't imagine anything," George said urgently. "Every moment was real. Every word of love I ever spoke to you was true." "Then why didn't you trust me?" Faith demanded. "Why didn't you tell me about the threats and let me help you figure out how to fight them?" George looked stricken. "Because I was young and stupid, and I thought I could handle it alone. Because I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to you. Because I loved you so much that the idea of you being hurt because of me was unbearable. So instead you hurt me yourself," Faith said quietly. "You decided what I could and couldn't handle, made choices about my life without consulting me, and then abandoned me to deal with the consequences alone." "Yes," George said simply, "and I've regretted it every day since." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 15 years of secrets and pain hanging between them. "What happened to Victor Blackstone?" Faith asked finally. George's expression darkened. "He got what he wanted. With me out of the picture and River Maritime weakened by the scandal of a runaway groom, he was able to pressure my father into selling. But it took 3 years, and by then my father was already sick. The stress of fighting Victor's hostile takeover attempts contributed to his heart attack." "I'm sorry," Faith said, meaning it. She'd always liked Thomas River, who treated her like a daughter during her relationship with George. Victor consolidated several shipping companies under the Blackstone name and became one of the most powerful men in the industry. But he never forgot about me. Never forgot that I'd cost him 3 years and millions in legal fees. Is he still a threat? George hesitated. That's complicated. There's that word again. Faith, there's something else you need to know. Something about why I'm really on this cruise. Faith felt a chill of foreboding. What do you mean? Victor Blackstone is aboard this ship. The words hit Faith like a physical blow. What? He's traveling under the name of a business consortium. But I recognized him yesterday during the captain's reception. He's older, but it's definitely him. Faith felt the deck seem to tilt beneath her feet. He's here, on this ship. The man who destroyed our lives is here? I think he's been planning this, George said grimly. I think he somehow knew I'd be on this cruise and arranged to be here too. He's not done with me, Faith. He's not done with his revenge. Faith backed away from George, overwhelmed by the revelation. This is insane. You're telling me that 15 years later, this man is still pursuing some kind of vendetta against you? Men like Victor Blackstone don't forgive, George said quietly. They don't forget, and they especially don't forgive being thwarted, even temporarily. What does he want now? I don't know yet. But whatever it is, I won't let him hurt you. Not again. Faith laughed, but there was no humor in it. How can you protect me from something you don't understand? How can you promise he won't hurt me when you don't even know what he's planning? Because this time, I won't run, George said fiercely. This time, I won't make decisions for you without consulting you. This time, if you'll let me, we'll face whatever comes together. Faith stared at him, seeing the determination in his expression, the love that had never died despite 15 years of separation. Part of her wanted to step into his arms, to reclaim the partnership they'd once shared, to face the future as a united front. But another part of her, the part that had spent 15 years learning to be strong alone, wasn't ready to trust him with her heart again. I need time to process this, she said finally, all of it. The truth about what happened, Victor Blackstone being here, what it all means. George nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Of course, I know it's a lot. It is. Faith wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the warm Mediterranean night. George, I'm glad you finally told me the truth. I needed to know. But I can't just forget 15 years of hurt, because you had noble reasons for breaking my heart. I understand, George said quietly. I don't expect forgiveness, Faith. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and that I've never stopped regretting it. Faith nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She turned to leave, then paused. George, earlier today, when Anastasia was talking about your relationship, she seemed to think you were more serious than you're describing. George's expression grew troubled. Anastasia has been hopeful about our future. She's been pushing for more commitment, and I've been avoiding the conversation because I knew my heart wasn't fully in it. But recently, she told me she was pregnant. Faith felt like she'd been slapped. Pregnant? It turned out to be a false alarm. Stress-related hormone fluctuations that mimicked pregnancy symptoms. But she hasn't told me yet that the test was wrong. I only found out by overhearing her talking to her doctor this morning. So she's lying to you? As she made her way back to her cabin, Faith's mind reeled with everything George had told her. The truth about their broken engagement was both better and worse than she'd imagined. Better, because it meant he hadn't stopped loving her. Worse, because it revealed how little he'd trusted her strength and judgment. And now Victor Blackstone was on this ship, apparently still nursing a 15-year-old grudge. Faith had thought the worst thing about this cruise would be dealing with her lingering feelings for George. She was beginning to realize that might be the least of her problems. But as she closed her cabin door behind her and tried to process the emotional upheaval of the evening, one thing was crystal clear. Despite the hurt and the years of separation, despite the complications and the unresolved issues, she was still desperately in love with George River. The question was whether love would be enough to overcome the damage that had been done, or if some betrayals were too deep to heal, even with the truth finally revealed. Faith barely slept that night, her mind churning with everything George had revealed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face on the observatory deck, the pain, the regret, the desperate love that had never died. By morning, she felt emotionally drained and more confused than ever. She was getting dressed when her phone rang. Celine's cheerful voice filled the small cabin. "Good morning, sunshine. How did your clandestine midnight meeting go?" "How did you know I went?" "Because I know you, and you've needed answers for 15 years. Still." Faith sank onto her bed and told Celine everything. Victor Blackstone's threats, the fabricated evidence, George's misguided attempt to protect her, and the revelation that their nemesis was currently aboard the ship. "Holy hell," Celine breathed when Faith finished. "That's like something out of a thriller novel." "I know, and the worst part is, I understand why George did what he did. I hate it, but I understand it." "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Faith admitted. "Part of me wants to forgive him, to try again. But Celine, he didn't trust me. He made a decision that affected both our lives without even consulting me." "He was 28 and terrified," Celine pointed out gently. "People make mistakes when they're scared, even good people who love us." Before Faith could respond, there was a sharp knock at her cabin door. "I have to go," she told Celine. "Someone's here." Faith opened the door to find a ship's officer standing in the corridor, his expression serious. "Miss Roberts, I'm Security Chief Martinez. I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred last night." Faith's blood chilled. "What kind of incident? May I come in?" Faith stepped aside, and the officer entered her small cabin. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, but a no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Roberts, we understand you had a meeting last night with George River on the observatory deck." "Yes," Faith said carefully. "Is that against ship policy?" "Not at all. However, after you left, Mr. River reported that he believed he was being watched during your conversation. He's concerned that someone may be targeting you as well." Faith felt a chill run down her spine. "Targeting me? What do you mean?" "Mr. River has informed us about his history with a man named Victor Blackstone, who he believes is aboard the ship under an assumed name. We're investigating, but in the meantime, we'd like you to be extra cautious." "What kind of precautions?" "Don't go anywhere alone, especially to isolated areas of the ship. Let us know immediately if anyone approaches you or makes you feel uncomfortable. And Miss Roberts," the officer's expression grew more serious, "Mr. River has requested that we assign you a security escort if you're willing to accept one." Faith's mind reeled. "He requested what?" "He's concerned for your safety. Given the history he's described, we think it's a reasonable precaution." "I don't need a babysitter," Faith said, her independence bristling at the suggestion. "No, ma'am, but you might need protection. We're dealing with someone who has a history of elaborate schemes and patient revenge. If Victor Blackstone has waited 15 years to complete whatever plan he has in mind, he won't hesitate to use you to get to Mr. River." The officer's words sent a chill through Faith. She was being drawn into a dangerous game she didn't understand, pulled back into George's complicated world, despite her best efforts to stay clear of it. "I'll be careful," she said finally. "We hope so, ma'am. Here's my card. Call immediately if anything seems off." After the officer left, Faith sat on her bed, staring at the security card in her hands. Her peaceful cruise had become something out of a nightmare, and she was right back where she'd been 15 years ago, caught in the crossfire of George River's complicated life. Her phone buzzed with a text from George. "I heard security spoke with you. I'm sorry for dragging you into this again. If you want to disembark at the next port, I'll arrange everything. I won't let my past hurt you anymore." Faith stared at the message, torn between anger and a reluctant admiration for his protectiveness. Running away would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But she'd spent 15 years running from George River and the feelings he inspired. Maybe it was time to stop running and face whatever came next. She texted back, "I'm not running, but we need to talk." His response was immediate. "Name the time and place. The main cool deck. 1 hour. Public place, lots of people around. I'll be there." Faith spent the next hour getting ready, choosing a red sundress that made her feel confident and strong. If she was going to face George and whatever danger lurked on this ship, she would do it on her own terms. The pool deck was crowded with passengers enjoying the morning sun as the ship sailed toward their next destination. Faith found George at a table near the bar, and her breath caught as she approached. He was wearing a navy polo shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders, and the worry lines around his eyes only made him more devastatingly attractive. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing as she approached. Faith sat across from him, maintaining distance even as her body responded to his proximity. "George, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same 22-year-old girl you left at the altar. I've spent 15 years building a life, becoming independent, learning to make my own decisions." "I know that," George said quietly, "and I admire the woman you've become. You're stronger now, more confident. It shows everything about you." "Then you need to stop making decisions for me," Faith said firmly. "Security escorts, suggestions that I leave the ship. You don't get to manage my life without consulting me." George's jaw tightened. "Faith, if Victor is planning something, then we'll face it together, as equals, or not at all." Faith interrupted. "I won't be protected like some helpless damsel. I won't be managed like a liability. If we're going to deal with this situation, we do it as partners." Something shifted in George's expression, surprise, respect, and a heat that made Faith's pulse quicken. "Partners," he repeated softly. "Partners," Faith confirmed, though the word felt loaded with more meaning than just their current crisis. George leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. "Faith, if we're going to be partners in this, there's something else you need to know. About Anastasia." Faith felt her stomach tighten. "What about her?" "I confronted her this morning about the pregnancy. She finally admitted it was a false positive, that she's known for days but was afraid to tell me." "What did you say?" "I told her our relationship was over," George said quietly. "I should have ended it months ago, but I was trying to be fair to her, trying to give her the commitment she wanted, even though my heart wasn't in it." Faith tried to ignore the flutter of hope in her chest. "How did she take it?" "Not well. She accused me of ending things because of you, and she wasn't wrong." George's eyes found Faith's. "I can't be with someone else when I'm still in love with you." The words hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. Faith felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the intensity of his gaze. "George," she began, but her words were interrupted by a commotion near the pool. A man was arguing loudly with one of the ship's staff, his voice carrying across the deck with an authority that demanded attention. Faith glanced over, then froze as she got a clear look at his face. He was older than she remembered, his dark hair now silver, his face lined with age and what looked like bitterness. But she recognized him instantly, from the photos that had once hung in the River Maritime offices. "Victor Blackstone." George followed her gaze and went rigid. "That's him," he said quietly. Faith watched as Victor continued his conversation with the staff member, gesturing emphatically. Even from a distance, she could sense the man's commanding presence, the way he expected to be obeyed without question. "He looks different than I remember," she murmured. 15 years will do that," George replied, his voice tight with tension. "But he's still the same man who threatened to destroy you to get to me." As if sensing their attention, Victor turned and scanned the pool deck. His gaze moved over the crowd of passengers until it landed on their table. When he saw George, his mouth curved in a smile that held no warmth. Then his eyes shifted to Faith, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Recognition flickered across Victor's features, followed by something that looked like satisfaction. He inclined his head in a mock bow, then turned and walked away, leaving Faith with the unsettling feeling that she'd just been marked as prey. "He knows I'm here," she said, her voice shakier than she'd intended. "Yes," George said grimly, "and he knows we're together. That's not good, Faith. That's very not good. What do you think he's planning?" "I don't know, but knowing Victor, it will be elaborate, public, and designed to cause maximum damage to both of us." George reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Faith, it's not too late to leave the ship. I can have you on a flight home by tonight." The touch of his hand sent electricity up Faith's arm. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she laced their fingers together, drawing strength from the connection. "I already told you, I'm not running. We're partners in this, remember? George stared down at their joined hands, his thumbs stroking across her knuckles in a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. Faith, there's something I need to tell you, he said quietly. Something I should have said last night. What? George raised his eyes to meet hers, and the love she saw there was so raw, so desperate, that it took her breath away. I know I have no right to ask this after what I did to you. I know I don't deserve a second chance. But Faith, being near you again, seeing the incredible woman you've become, I can't pretend anymore. I can't act like what we had was just young love that we've outgrown. Faith's heart was racing, her body humming with awareness of his touch, his proximity, the intensity of his gaze. George, I'm still in love with you, he continued urgently. Desperately, completely in love with you. I know 15 years have passed. I know we're different people now, but my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've gotten stronger. Faith felt tears prick at her eyes. You can't just say things like that and expect. I don't expect anything, George interrupted gently. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens with Victor, whatever danger we're facing, I needed you to know that loving you has been the one constant in my life for the past 19 years. Faith stared at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression. This was the man she'd fallen in love with at 22. Passionate, intense, completely devoted when he loved. But now he had the depth and maturity that came with experience, with loss, with learning from his mistakes. I never stopped loving you either, she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her soul. George's eyes flared with hope and something much hotter. Faith. But that doesn't mean we can just pick up where we left off, she continued quickly. Too much has happened. We need to take this slowly, figure out who we are now, whether we can really trust each other again. I understand, George said, though his grip on her hand tightened. I'll take whatever you're willing to give me. Friendship, partnership, the chance to earn your trust again. Anything is more than I deserve. Faith looked at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Despite everything, the hurt, the years of separation, the dangerous situation they now faced, she felt something inside her chest unfurling, like a flower in sunlight. Hope, possibility, the tentative beginning of healing. Partners, she said again, but this time the word carried a different weight. Partners, George agreed, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was gentle, reverent, but it sent fire racing through Faith's veins. She found herself remembering how his mouth had once felt on her skin, how he could make her feel like the most cherished woman in the world with just a touch. We should probably get back to our cabins, she said, though she made no move to pull her hand away. Regroup, figure out what to do about Victor. Probably, George agreed, but he also didn't let go of her hand. They sat there for a moment longer, both reluctant to break the spell that had woven around them. Faith felt as though she stood at a crossroads. She could choose safety, could pull back and protect her heart from the man who'd once shattered it. Or she could choose courage, could take the risk of loving George River again, knowing that this time the stakes were even higher. Faith, George said softly, and something in his voice made her look up. He was watching her with an expression of such tender longing that it made her breath catch. Whatever happens next, whatever Victor has planned, I want you to know that these past 2 days, being near you again, have been the best days I've had in 15 years. Faith felt her carefully guarded heart crack open a little more. George, I know we need to take things slowly, he continued. I know I need to earn your trust, but Faith, I need you to know that I would do anything, to protect you, to make up for the hurt I caused you, to prove that you can depend on me. Before Faith could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Celine. Emergency. Need to see you right now, my cabin. Faith frowned at the message. I have to go. Celine needs me. George immediately released her hand and stood. I'll walk you. You don't have to. Partners, remember? And until we know what Victor is planning, I'm not letting you wander the ship alone. Faith wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but the memory of Victor's cold smile made her reconsider. Okay, but we're just walking together. This isn't you protecting helpless little me. George's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Understood. Just two partners heading in the same direction. As they made their way through the ship's corridors, Faith was acutely aware of George beside her. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the way other passengers' eyes followed him, the way his presence made her feel both safe and dangerously alive. Whatever was waiting for them in Celine's cabin, whatever Victor Blackstone was planning, whatever complications lay ahead, Faith knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was still hopelessly, desperately in love with George River. The question was whether love would be enough to overcome the obstacles standing between them, or if they were doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. But as George's hand brushed against hers as they walked, sending sparks of electricity up her arm, Faith found herself willing to find out. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and taking a chance on love? These impossible choices shape us all. Let me know in the comments what you would do. And don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's conclusion. Faith wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but the memory of Victor's cold smile made her reconsider whether love would be enough to overcome the obstacles standing between them, or if they were doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. But as George's hand brushed against hers as they walked, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way other passengers' eyes followed him, the way his presence made her feel both safe and dangerously alive. Faith wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but the memory of Victor's cold smile made her reconsider. It's impossible choices shape us all. Let me know in the comments what you would do. And don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's conclusion. They found Celine pacing her cabin like a caged animal, her usually perfect blonde hair disheveled and her face pale with worry. "Thank God you're here," she said, rushing to Faith the moment they entered. "We have a problem. A big problem." "What's wrong?" Faith asked, immediately concerned by her friend's agitation. Celine glanced at George uncertainly. "Should we be talking about this in front of him?" "He's part of this now," Faith said firmly. "We're partners." "Tell me what happened." Celine took a shaky breath. "I was at the spa this morning, getting a massage, when I overheard two women talking in the next treatment room. One of them was that Anastasia woman, George's business partner. The other was someone I didn't recognize. But they were talking about you, Faith." Faith felt a chill run down her spine. What were they saying? Anastasia was furious about George breaking up with her. She kept saying that you were the reason, that if you were out of the picture, George would come back to her. Celine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Faith, I think she's working with Victor Blackstone." George went very still. "What exactly did you hear?" "The other woman, she had some kind of accent, maybe Russian or Eastern European. She was asking Anastasia about your schedule, your habits, where you like to spend time on the ship. And Anastasia was answering her, giving her detailed information about your movements." Faith sank onto Celine's bed, feeling overwhelmed. So not only is Victor Blackstone planning something, but he's recruited George's ex-girlfriend to help him. "It gets worse," Celine continued. "They mentioned something about tonight, some kind of plan that would eliminate the Faith Roberts problem permanently, and make George understand the consequences of his choices." George began pacing the small cabin, his hands clenched into fists. "I should have seen this coming. Anastasia was too calm about our breakup this morning. She should have been more upset, more angry. Instead, she just accepted it. Because she already had a backup plan," Faith said quietly. "George, what kind of woman is Anastasia? I mean, really, is she capable of violence?" George ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "She's ambitious, ruthless in business, and she doesn't handle rejection well. But actual violence? I don't know. Thought I knew her, but clearly I was wrong about a lot of things." "We need to go to security," Faith said, standing up. "Tell them what Celine heard." "With what proof?" George asked. "Overheard conversations in a spa? Victor's too smart to leave evidence lying around, and Anastasia will just claim it was a misunderstanding." Celine cleared her throat. "Actually, I might have proof." Both Faith and George turned to stare at her. I recorded part of their conversation on my phone, Celine said, looking slightly embarrassed. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but something about their tone made me think you might need evidence. You recorded them? Faith asked, impressed despite the circumstances. Just the last few minutes. When they were talking about tonight's plan, it's not great quality. There's background noise from the spa, but you can hear them clearly enough. George held out his hand. Can I listen to it? Celine handed over her phone, and George played the recording, his expression growing darker with each word. Faith could hear Anastasia's voice clearly, discussing timing and opportunities, and another woman responding with what sounded like professional expertise. The other woman, George said when the recording ended. I recognize the accent now. She's definitely Eastern European, probably Russian. Victor has connections to some very unsavory people through his business dealings. Faith felt sick. You think he hired a professional? I think Victor Blackstone is willing to do whatever it takes to get his revenge, and he's not concerned about collateral damage. George handed the phone back to Celine. We're taking this to security immediately. Wait. Faith said, grabbing George's arm. If we go to security now, Victor will know we're on to him. He might accelerate whatever he's planning, or he might just disappear and try again later, somewhere else. So what are you suggesting? Faith took a deep breath, knowing she was about to propose something dangerous but necessary. I think we should let them think their plan is working. Let them make their move, but be ready for them. Absolutely not, George said immediately. Faith, I won't use you as bait. You won't be using me as anything. Faith replied firmly. This would be my choice, my decision to end this once and for all, instead of looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. George stared at her, conflict written across his features. Faith, you don't understand how dangerous Victor can be. Then explain it to me. Trust me enough to tell me what we're really dealing with, and let me make an informed decision about my own life. For a moment, Faith thought George might refuse. But then he sighed and sat down heavily in Celine's desk chair. Victor Blackstone isn't just a businessman, he said quietly. He's built his empire through intimidation, blackmail, and worse. Over the years, several people who've stood in his way have had accidents, competitors who've mysteriously lost important contracts, investigators who've suddenly dropped cases against him, former employees who've disappeared rather than testify against him. Faith felt cold, but she kept her voice steady. Has anyone ever proven he was responsible? No. Victor is too smart, too careful. He always has alibis, always uses intermediaries, always makes sure there's no trail leading back to him. But the pattern is clear to anyone who looks closely enough. And you think he's capable of murder? George met her eyes directly. I think Victor Blackstone is capable of anything if it serves his purposes. And Faith, you need to understand, his vendetta against me isn't just about business anymore. It's personal. I cost him time, money, and face when I thwarted his original takeover attempt. Men like Victor don't forget that kind of humiliation. Celine had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Faith, maybe George is right. Maybe we should just go to security and let them handle this. And what happens then? Faith asked. Victor disappears, waits a few months or a few years, and tries again? I can't live like that, Celine. I won't spend the rest of my life afraid. She turned to George. You said yourself that we're partners in this. Partners make decisions together. I'm not some helpless victim to be protected. I'm a grown woman who can assess risks and make choices about her own life. George stared at her for a long moment, and Faith could see the war between his protective instincts and his respect for her independence. If we did this, he said finally, and I'm not saying we should, we'd need backup. Security would have to be involved, even if they stayed in the background. Agreed, Faith said immediately. And you'd have to do exactly what I say when it comes to safety protocols. No arguing, no second-guessing. If I tell you to run, you run. Faith bristled slightly at his tone, but she recognized the fear underneath his authoritative manner. Within reason, yes, but George, I won't be treated like a child or a liability. We do this as equals, or we don't do it at all. Excuse me, Celine interrupted, but am I the only one who thinks this entire plan is insane? Faith, You're talking about deliberately putting yourself in danger to catch a man who may be a murderer. I'm talking about taking control of a situation instead of being a victim of it, Faith corrected. Celine, I spent 15 years letting fear control my life. Fear of being hurt again, fear of trusting the wrong person, fear of taking risks. I won't do it anymore. She looked at George. If we're going to do this, we need to know exactly what they're planning. Where, when, how. We need to turn their trap into our trap. George was quiet for a long moment, studying Faith's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something that sounded like pride mixed with terror. You really have changed, he said softly. The Faith I knew 15 years ago never would have suggested something this risky. The Faith you knew 15 years ago had never had her heart broken by the person she trusted most. Faith replied, I learned that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. George nodded slowly. All right, if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. We'll involve security, but quietly. We'll set up surveillance, establish escape routes, make sure we have backup at every step. And we need to figure out exactly what they're planning, Faith added. Celine, do you think you could get close to them again? Maybe at the spa, or in one of the lounges? Celine looked terrified at the prospect. Faith, I'm not cut out for espionage. I'm a dental hygienist from Ohio. You're also my best friend, and you're the only one they don't know is connected to our investigation, Faith pointed out gently. You don't have to do anything dangerous. Just listen, observe. Maybe try to get more information about their timeline. I'll do it, Celine said after a moment, though she didn't look happy about it. But if this gets me killed, I'm haunting both of you. George stood up, his expression determined. I'll contact security and brief them on the situation. We'll need to set up a communication system, establish checkpoints, and make sure we have multiple contingency plans. What do you want me to do? Faith asked. Act normal, George said. Maintain your usual routines, but stay in public areas. Don't go anywhere alone, and keep your phone with you at all times. Faith nodded, then paused. George, there's something else we need to consider. If this goes wrong, if something happens to me. Nothing will happen to you, George interrupted fiercely. I won't let it. You can't promise that, Faith said quietly. None of us can. But George, if something does happen, I need you to know that I don't blame you. I'm making this choice with full knowledge of the risks. Whatever comes next, it's not your fault. George stared at her, his blue eyes dark with emotion. Faith. I mean it, she continued. I spent 15 years blaming you for making decisions about my life without consulting me. I won't let you blame yourself for respecting my decision to make this choice. George moved closer, reaching out to cup her face gently in his hands. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, he said softly, and I'm terrified of losing you again. Then don't lose me, Faith whispered. Stay close, stay smart, and we'll get through this together. George's thumb stroked across her cheekbone, and Faith felt herself leaning into his touch, despite the danger surrounding them. Being near him still felt like coming home, even after all these years. I need to make those calls, George said reluctantly, his hands dropping from her face. Faith, please be careful. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I'll be fine, Faith assured him. Just, George, after this is over, after we deal with Victor and get through tonight, we need to talk. Really talk about what this means for us. I know, George said, his voice rough with emotion. And Faith, whatever happens tonight, whatever we have to face, I want you to know that being with you again, even under these circumstances, has reminded me what it feels like to be truly alive. Faith felt her heart skip a beat at the intensity in his voice. George. I should go, he said, moving toward the door. The sooner I brief security, the sooner we can get this plan in motion. After George left, Faith and Celine sat in silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to do. Faith, Celine said finally, are you sure about this? Really, truly sure? Faith considered the question, weighing her fear against her determination. No, she said honestly. I'm terrified, but I'm also tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's actions control my life. And if something goes wrong, then at least I'll have tried to take control of my own destiny instead of being a victim of someone else's. Faith looked at her best friend. Celine, you don't have to do this. I can find another way to get information about their plans. Are you kidding? Celine said with a shaky laugh. I've been your best friend for 15 years. I'm not abandoning you now, even if this is the most terrifying thing I've ever agreed to do. Faith felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's loyalty. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Celine said dryly. Thank me after we're all still alive tomorrow morning. As Faith made her way back to her cabin, her mind raced with plans and contingencies. Tonight would determine not just her safety, but her future, with George, with her newfound courage, with the life she was finally ready to claim for herself. She thought about George's words, about being truly alive. For 15 years, she'd been existing rather than living, going through the motions of a life without the passion and intensity that had once defined her. Being with George again had awakened something in her that she'd thought was lost forever. Whether they could rebuild their relationship remained to be seen, but she was grateful for the reminder that she was capable of feeling deeply, of loving completely, of taking risks for something that mattered. Tonight would test all of those rediscovered strengths. Faith just hoped she was strong enough to survive what was coming, and wise enough to recognize the difference between courage and foolishness. But as she closed her cabin door behind her and began preparing for whatever the evening would bring, Faith felt a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. She was exactly where she needed to be, making exactly the choices she needed to make. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as a victim, not as someone to be protected, but as a woman who had learned to fight for what mattered most. The rest of the day passed in a blur of careful planning and mounting tension. George had met with Security Chief Martinez, who agreed to coordinate a discreet surveillance operation. Celine had managed to position herself near Anastasia at the pool bar and overheard enough to confirm that something was planned for the evening's formal dinner and dance. As Faith prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of her life, she found herself thinking about courage and love and the choices that define us. She chose a midnight blue gown that made her feel beautiful and strong, styled her hair in an elegant updo, and applied makeup with steady hands despite her racing heart. A soft knock at her door made her pulse quicken. She opened it to find George standing in the corridor, devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and the silver at his temples. "You look," he began, then stopped, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. "Terrified but determined," Faith supplied. "Breathtaking," George finished softly. "Faith, you are absolutely breathtaking." Heat flooded Faith's cheeks at the reverence in his voice. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." They stood there for a moment, both acutely aware that this might be their last quiet moment together before whatever storm was about to break. "Security is in position," George said finally. "Martinez has people stationed throughout the dining room and ballroom, and they'll be monitoring all communications. If anything goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Faith interrupted, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. "We're ready for them, George. We know they're coming." George stepped closer, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. "Faith, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If things go badly, if the situation gets out of control, promise me you'll run. Don't try to be a hero. Don't worry about me. Just get to safety." Faith looked up into his worried blue eyes, seeing the love and fear warring there. "I promise to be smart," she said carefully. "But I won't abandon you, George. We're in this together." George's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Together," he agreed, though she could see it cost him to say it. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender and protective that Faith felt tears prick her eyes. "Whatever happens tonight," George murmured against her skin, "I want you to know that these past 3 days with you have been worth everything. Worth 15 years of regret, worth whatever comes next." Faith's breath caught. "George, I love you," he said simply, pulling back to meet her eyes. "I've loved you for 19 years, and I'll love you for the rest of my life, however long that might be." The words hung between them, precious and terrifying in their finality. Faith reached up to cup his face, memorizing the feel of his skin beneath her palms. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never stopped, not really. And after tonight, when this is all over, we're going to have that future we planned all those years ago. George's eyes flared with hope and something much deeper, faith. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and desperate, pouring 15 years of longing into the contact. Faith melted into him, remembering how perfectly they fit together, how he could make the rest of the world disappear with just a touch. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "We should go," George said reluctantly. "The formal dinner starts in 20 minutes. Faith nodded, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "Let's end this." The ship's main dining room had been transformed for the formal evening, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over elegantly set tables and arrangements of white roses. Passengers in evening wear moved through the space with the relaxed confidence of people on vacation, unaware of the danger lurking among them. Faith and George were seated at a table near the center of the room, visible from multiple angles, accessible, perfect bait. Celine was at a nearby table with several other single passengers, positioned to observe while staying out of the line of fire. As the first course was served, Faith spotted Anastasia across the room. George's former business partner looked stunning in a silver gown that emphasized her pale beauty, but there was something sharp and predatory in her expression as she surveyed the dining room. "She's here," Faith murmured to George. "I see her. Martinez, can you confirm Anastasia Gray's location?" George spoke quietly into the nearly invisible microphone clipped to his lapel. "Confirmed," came the security chief's voice through their earpieces. "Target 2 is at table 15, northwest corner. No sign of target 1 yet. Victor Blackstone." Faith's stomach tightened as she scanned the room for any sign of the man who had orchestrated their separation 15 years ago. "There," George said quietly, nodding toward the entrance. Victor entered the dining room with the commanding presence Faith remembered. Though age had added gravitas to his bearing, he was accompanied by a striking woman with dark hair and sharp features, undoubtedly the woman with the accent that Celine had overheard. "Target 1 has entered the venue," Martinez's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Accompanied by unidentified female, approximately 35 years old, Eastern European features. All units maintain position." Faith watched as Victor's eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and security positions with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. When his gaze landed on their table, he smiled. The same cold expression she'd seen by the pool. "He's seen us," Faith said. "Good," George replied grimly. "Let him think he's in control." The first part of dinner proceeded normally, with the usual shipboard entertainment and conversation. But Faith could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm, could see the way Victor's companion kept checking her watch, the way Anastasia's eyes never left their table. As the main course was cleared and the evening's dancing began in the adjacent ballroom, George stood and offered Faith his hand. "Dance with me?" he asked, and Faith could hear the double meaning in the words. "Always," she replied, taking his hand and letting him lead her onto the dance floor. The ballroom was dimly lit, with couples swaying to the orchestra's romantic melodies. George pulled Faith into his arms, and for a moment, the danger surrounding them faded into background noise. "You're a better dancer than you were at 28, Faith observed as George led her through a complex turn. "I had time to practice," George replied. "Though I imagined dancing with you every time." The confession made Faith's chest tighten with emotion. "George, I know we agreed to take things slowly," he continued, spinning her gently before pulling her close again. "But Faith, if something happens tonight..." "Nothing will happen," Faith insisted. "We're going to dance, we're going to catch the bad guys, and then we're going to have a very long conversation about our future." George's arms tightened around her. "Promise me." "I promise," Faith said, though the words felt like a vow she might not be able to keep. As they moved together across the dance floor, Faith became aware of other couples positioning themselves around them. She recognized several security officers from George's earlier briefing, their partners likely backup personnel. "They're moving," George said quietly, his eyes focused over Faith's shoulder. Faith resisted the urge to turn around. "Where?" Anastasia is heading for the terrace doors. Victor and his companion are separating. She's moving toward the bar. He's coming this way. Faith's pulse quickened. What do we do? We keep dancing, George said firmly. Let them make the first move. The song ended, and couples began shifting and changing partners in the usual social dance. Faith found herself spun away from George, into the arms of a stranger, a distinguished older man with silver hair and cold gray eyes, Victor Blackstone. Miss Roberts, he said pleasantly, as if they were old friends meeting at a cocktail party. How lovely to see you again after all these years. Faith forced herself to smile, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Mr. Blackstone, what a coincidence, meeting you here. Oh, there's nothing coincidental about it, my dear, Victor replied, leading her through the dance steps with practiced ease. I've been planning this reunion for quite some time. Over Victor's shoulder, Faith could see George dancing with Victor's companion, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. Have you? Faith kept her voice light, conversational. And what exactly are you hoping to accomplish? Victor's grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. Justice, Miss Roberts. After 15 years, it's time for George River to face the consequences of his choices. What choices would those be? The choice to humiliate me. The choice cost me time and money and reputation. The choice to believe that love could triumph over consequences. Victor's smile never wavered, but Faith could see the malice burning in his eyes. That was 15 years ago, Faith said carefully. Surely you've moved on by now. Men like me don't move on, Miss Roberts. We plan, we wait, we execute our revenge when it will cause maximum damage. Victor spun her expertly, bringing her closer. And what could cause George River more damage than losing the woman he spent 15 years pining for? Faith felt ice flood her veins, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. Of course you do, Victor said softly. You're going to have an accident tonight, Miss Roberts. A tragic fall from the ship's upper deck, perhaps. Or maybe a case of food poisoning that proves mysteriously fatal. The details are unimportant. What matters is that George will know it was his fault. That his actions 15 years ago led directly to your death. The casual way Victor discussed her murder made Faith's skin crawl, but she forced herself to keep dancing, to maintain the facade of normalcy. Security is listening to every word you're saying, she said quietly. Victor chuckled. My dear girl, do you really think I'm not prepared for such basic precautions? Even now, my associate is ensuring that your security friends are distracted. As if summoned by his words, the lights in the ballroom suddenly flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. But in those few seconds of darkness, Faith felt Victor's grip on her arm become painful. Time to go, Miss Roberts, he said, no longer bothering with pleasantries. Faith tried to pull away, but Victor's companion had appeared beside them, something small and sharp pressed against Faith's ribs. I wouldn't struggle if I were you, the woman said in accented English. This will all be much easier if you cooperate. Faith's eyes searched the chaos of the darkened ballroom for George, for security, for anyone who might help. But the emergency lighting made it impossible to distinguish faces clearly, and panicked passengers were already beginning to crowd toward the exits. Faith, George's voice cut through the confusion, closer than she'd expected. Here, she called back, just as Victor began pulling her toward a service door she hadn't noticed before. George, watch out. Faith shouted as Victor's companion moved away from her and toward the sound of George's voice. Faith saw the flash of metal in the woman's hand, a knife, small but deadly sharp. Without thinking, she threw herself sideways, knocking into the woman, just as George appeared through the crowd. The woman stumbled, her knife flying wide, and George tackled her to the ground. But Victor used the distraction to drag Faith through the service door and into a maintenance corridor she'd never seen before. Very touching, Victor said as they moved through the narrow hallway. But ultimately pointless. Your boyfriend can't save you from gravity, Miss Roberts. Faith realized they were heading toward an exterior stairway, probably leading to one of the ship's upper decks. Her heart hammered as she understood Victor's plan. Stage her death as an accident, a tragic fall during the confusion of a power outage. "They'll know it wasn't an accident," Faith said, struggling against Victor's grip on her arm. "Will they?" A young woman, upset by a romantic reunion gone wrong, had too much to drink at the formal dinner. In the confusion of a power failure, she became disoriented and fell from an upper deck. Tragic, but hardly suspicious. They'd reached a heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Victor produced a keycard from his jacket. Clearly he'd planned this down to the smallest detail. The door opened onto a narrow exterior stairway leading to the ship's uppermost deck. The Mediterranean wind whipped Faith's hair around her face, and she could hear the ocean far below. "After you, Miss Roberts," Victor said with mock courtesy. Faith looked up the stairs, calculating her chances. Victor was older than George, but still strong, and she was wearing heels and a formal gown. Running wasn't really an option. But maybe she didn't need to run. Maybe she just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. "You know, Mr. Blackstone," Faith said, turning to face him with as much composure as she could muster. "For someone who claims to be intelligent, you've made some serious mistakes tonight." Victor's eyebrows rose. "Have I? You assumed I was the same frightened 22-year-old you terrorized 15 years ago. You assumed George was the same naive young man who could be manipulated by threats. And most importantly, you assumed we were as unprepared as we were back then." "What are you talking about?" Faith smiled, hoping she looked more confident than she felt. "I'm talking about the fact that every word you've said tonight has been recorded and transmitted to both ship security and the FBI. Victor's expression darkened. "Impossible." "Is it? You said yourself that modern surveillance techniques are quite sophisticated. Did you really think we'd walk into your trap without taking precautions?" For the first time since she'd known him, Victor Blackstone looked uncertain. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Then why do you think the power outage only lasted 30 seconds before the backup systems kicked in? Why do you think your associate with the knife was subdued so quickly? We've been 3 steps ahead of you all night, Victor." Victor's face contorted with rage. "It doesn't matter. Even if you recorded our conversation, even if you have evidence, you'll still be dead. George will still know it was his fault." He lunged toward her, clearly intending to force her up the stairs, but Faith was ready. She grabbed a stair railing with both hands and kicked backward with one heeled foot, catching Victor in the shin hard enough to make him howl with pain. "Faith!" George's voice came from behind them as the service door burst open. Victor spun toward the sound, momentarily distracted, and Faith used the opportunity to dodge away from the stairs. But Victor recovered quickly, pulling something from his jacket, not a knife, but a small pistol. "Don't move," he snarled, pointing the weapon alternately at Faith and George. "Either of you." George raised his hands slowly, his eyes never leaving Faith's face. "Let her go, Victor. Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel is with both of you," Victor replied. "You cost me everything 15 years ago. Now it's time to collect the debt." Victor Blackstone put down the weapon. Security Chief Martinez's voice boomed from the doorway, where several armed officers had appeared. Victor glanced at the security team, then back at Faith and George. For a moment, Faith thought he might surrender. The odds were clearly against him, and there was nowhere to run. But then Victor's face twisted into a bitter smile. "If I can't have my revenge the way I planned it," he said, raising the pistol toward Faith, "I'll settle for a different kind of justice." Everything happened at once. George threw himself toward Faith, trying to shield her with his body. Martinez and his team shouted warnings, and Faith, driven by instincts she didn't know she possessed, dropped to the deck just as the pistol fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Faith felt George's weight crash down on top of her, driving the breath from her lungs. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't tell if the warm wetness she felt was seawater from the deck or something worse. "George," she gasped, struggling to get out from under him. "George, are you hurt?" He rolled off her with a groan, and Faith saw blood on his white shirt, but he was conscious, alert, and reaching for her with desperate hands. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands running over her arms and torso, checking for injuries. "No, I'm fine, but you?" "Just grazed," George said quickly. though the blood on his shirt suggested it was more than a graze. "Faith, are you sure you're not hurt?" Before she could answer, Martinez and his team had secured the area. Victor was on the ground, disarmed and being handcuffed, his face a mask of frustrated rage. Subject secured. Martinez spoke into his radio. "We need medical to deck 12, exterior stairway 7. Gunshot wound, not life-threatening but requiring immediate attention." Faith found herself shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. George pulled her against his chest with his uninjured arm, and she buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with the salt air. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Faith, it's finally over." She pulled back to look at him, seeing the pain he was trying to hide and the overwhelming relief in his eyes. "Your shoulder," she said, noticing how carefully he was holding his left arm. "It's fine," George insisted. "Faith, when I saw him point that gun at you, and I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to." "Shh," Faith interrupted, pressing her fingers gently to his lips. "Don't. We're both fine. We're both alive. And Victor Blackstone will never threaten anyone again." George captured her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I need to tell you something." "What?" "When I threw myself in front of you, it wasn't because I thought you couldn't handle yourself. It wasn't because I was trying to protect the helpless little woman." Faith frowned. "Then why?" George's eyes were intense, burning with emotion. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of a world without you in it. Because my life means nothing if you're not alive to share it. Because I love you more than I love my own safety." Tears spilled down Faith's cheeks. "George, these past 3 days, watching you stand up to Victor, watching you refuse to be intimidated or managed or protected, Faith, you've become everything I always knew you could be. You're stronger than I ever was, braver than I ever dreamed of being." "I'm not brave," Faith protested. "I was terrified." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," George said softly. "It means you do what needs to be done despite the fear. And tonight, you are magnificent." Before Faith could respond, the medical team arrived, bustling around them with efficient concern. As they began treating George's shoulder wound, Faith heard Martinez speaking quietly into his radio about federal charges and extradition procedures. "What will happen to Victor?" she asked. "He'll face federal charges for kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy," Martinez replied. "With the evidence we collected tonight, including the recordings of his threats, he'll be looking at decades in prison." "And Anastasia?" "She's already provided a statement in exchange for a plea agreement. Apparently Victor approached her weeks ago with his plan, and she agreed to help because she thought eliminating you would bring George back to her." Faith shook her head in amazement. She was willing to be an accessory to murder because of jealousy? "People do terrible things when they're desperate," Martinez said. "But she'll face consequences too. Conspiracy charges, accessory after the fact. Her cooperation will help her sentence, but she won't escape justice." As the medical team finished treating George's wound, a deep graze that would heal cleanly with proper care, Faith found herself looking out at the Mediterranean, thinking about second chances and the courage required to claim them. "What are you thinking about?" George asked, following her gaze. "About how 3 days ago I thought my biggest problem was getting over you," Faith said with a shaky laugh. "Now I'm thinking about whether I want to spend the rest of my life with you." George went very still. "And?" Faith turned to face him fully, seeing the hope and fear warring in his expression. "I'm thinking that 15 years ago, we were too young to understand that love alone isn't enough, that you need trust and communication and the willingness to face problems together instead of making unilateral decisions about each other's lives. Faith, I'm also thinking," she continued, "that we're not those young people anymore. We've both learned from our mistakes. We've both grown into people who might actually be capable of building something lasting." George's eyes searched her face. "What are you saying?" Faith took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "I'm saying that I want to try again, not to recapture what we had 15 years ago, but to build something new, something better, something based on who we are now, not who we used to be." The smile that spread across George's face was radiant. "Faith, are you sure?" "I'm sure that I love you," Faith said firmly. "I'm sure that tonight proved we can face danger together, that we can trust each other when it matters most. I'm sure that whatever challenges come next, I want to face them with you." George reached into his jacket pocket with his good arm, wincing slightly at the movement. When his hand emerged, he was holding a small velvet box that made Faith's breath catch. "George, what?" "I've carried this with me every day for 15 years, he said quietly, opening the box to reveal the engagement ring she'd given back to him so long ago. "I know it's presumptuous, and I know we agreed to take things slowly, but Faith—" "Yes," Faith interrupted, her heart pounding. "You don't even know what I was going to ask." "You were going to ask me to marry you," Faith said, tears streaming down her face. "And the answer is yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you. Yes to everything, George. Just yes." George slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and Faith marveled at how perfectly it still fit, how right it felt to wear his ring again. "I love you," George said, pulling her into his arms despite his injured shoulder. "I've loved you for 19 years, and I'll love you for the rest of my life." "I love you too," Faith whispered against his lips. "And this time, nothing is going to keep us apart." They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, as the Mediterranean stars wheeled overhead and the ship carried them toward their future. It had taken 15 years, a chance encounter, and a dangerous confrontation with their past. But they had finally found their way back to each other, and this time, Faith knew with absolute certainty they would never let go again. As the ship's medical team finished their work and the security officers completed their reports, Faith and George stood together at the railing, watching the moonlight dance on the dark water. The danger was over. Victor Blackstone was in custody, and they had the rest of their lives to explore the second chance they'd been given. "What happens now?" Faith asked, leaning against George's uninjured side. "Now we go home," George said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We plan a wedding, a real one this time, with no secrets and no threats. We build a life together, face whatever challenges come our way as partners." "Partners," Faith repeated, smiling at how much that word had come to mean to them. "Always partners," George confirmed. "In everything, for the rest of our lives." Faith looked down at the engagement ring sparkling on her finger, then up at the man who had been her first love, her greatest heartbreak, and now, finally, her future. Sometimes the greatest love stories weren't about perfect timing or easy romance. Sometimes they were about finding the courage to forgive, the strength to trust again, and the wisdom to recognize that true love was worth fighting for, no matter how long it took to find your way back to each other. As the cruise ship sailed through the Mediterranean night toward whatever adventures awaited them, Faith knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest love story yet. Have you ever gotten a second chance at your greatest love? What would you do if the person you thought was lost forever walked back into your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more passionate love stories that will touch your heart. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale of true love conquering all. Tomorrow, I have another incredible story of unexpected love that will leave you breathless. You won't want to miss it.